Wood is going to join us later on the show on Wednesday Night Rugby, but in the meantime we just wanted to touch on the HIA in rugby itself and the HIA protocol, which have been very much to the fore over the past week in New Zealand. All of this against a backdrop of elite players in their 40s, the likes of Steve Thompson and Carl Heyman, big names in the game, jump to mind, being diagnosed with early onset dementia. Very happy to say Dr. Barry O'Driscoll is on the line. Evening, Dr. O'Driscoll, great to have you with us.
Hi, nice to be with you.
So just to clarify briefly, I'm sure people are vaguely aware of your story, but you were with World Rugby and stepped down a decade ago now, in part to do with the HIA and return to play protocol and issues in that general vicinity.
That's absolutely right. I had been on the concussion committee and their representative at the World Committee meetings for 10 years, and I was getting increasingly disturbed by the way they were treating head injuries, and then they decided to bring in a HIA, a 5-minute assessment of teenagers at that time in the World Under-20 Championship, which Ireland played in South Africa, a 5-minute assessment which they claimed would rule out concussion. I resigned at that stage. And I've done my best ever since to bring it to people's attention. And I think that 10 years later, what's happened in the last week or two with the head injuries, I think just proves that they are playing Russian roulette here. They do not have any consistency whatsoever, and it's not scientifically based after 10 years.
A question I want to ask, for instance, so you take Jeremy Loughman, and the rules are that if any player exhibits signs of concussion or has, I think the word is like a likely concussion, then what should have happened is the HIA would have been bypassed and he should have just sat out. Now that didn't happen for reasons we can touch on in a moment. But likely concussion means no HIA, you're out of the game, whereas potential concussion means a HIA. How easy is it for a medical professional to make the distinction between likely concussion and potential concussion?
I have in my time been a team doctor. It's impossible. Simple as that, and you only have to watch it every Saturday. The number of players coming off for HIAs who they say, well, it's just potential. And these are players who haven't been able to get up off the ground and after a head injury, and they're saying, well, it's not suspect. These players should not be having a HIA. They're suspect, and therefore they stay off. What is a potential concussion on a rugby field? Please tell me that. Every time the scrum goes down and they bang into each other, there's potentially a concussion there. And I don't know what a potential concussion is, except that it's rugby. And the suspect one is when they show signs of symptoms. So it's completely irresponsible and inconsistent what they're doing. And after 10 years of perfecting this, we've seen what's happened in the last couple of weeks, the difference in what happened to Curry, the English, Johnny Sexton, Loughman, Francis, the Welsh prof. They're all having different interpretations on the state they're in. And that's terribly sad, because we know that the brain, if you go back on and you have been concussed, the brain is much more vulnerable. In
Loughman's instance, he had the hit and then he was exhibiting signs of concussion on the pitch and he had the HIA. Now, it transpires the issue there, the reason he had the HIA is that the video replays of him looking very dazed and confused and exhibiting signs of concussion, the video replay wasn't available to the Irish medical team, nor was it available to the HIA independent doctor, and therefore the HIA happened. He passed the HIA, and it was only at half time that the Irish medical team saw the video of Loughman looking in some distress after the hit, and on that basis he was withdrawn from the game. But it jumped out, I suppose, to the layman that he had this very significant hit. He looked very dazed and confused, and yet he passed the HIA. And so that led to misgivings about the HIA and the standard of the HIA, or how much we can rely on the HIA. I mean, unless Loughman is particularly resistant to concussion despite the significance of the hit, I don't know.
Well, I think you've covered it very well there. The whole thing, that just was, he wants to demonstrate to people that the HIA doesn't work. There was a referee on the field, there were doctors watching, there were players watching, and none of them even thought there was a potential or a suspect head injury there, and then he has the HIA, and he passes it. It makes me very, very angry. The number of brain injuries rugby is now responsible for, and unfortunately, the damage done in many cases doesn't show for some years to come. And they've been experimenting with this for 10 years now.
The other, it seems, I want to ask you, Achilles heel or fundamental flaw in the HIA is that, is it right that you may take a bang and it may only be in the 12, 24 hours after that you realise one is concussed?
Well, this is the whole point, and when it was first introduced in Boston, and they did research on it there, and that they found out that you shouldn't, in fact, do the HIA for 10 to 15 minutes, because that's when the symptoms and signs start to appear. So some may well appear before and some may well appear afterwards. But it's well recognised, this is in casualty departments, never mind rugby, this is across the board to people who are not playing sport and that 24 hours after a possibility of a head injury, possibility of concussion, the symptoms may arise. And yet we in rugby, we are extraordinarily clever. We can sort it out in 10 minutes.
I'm conscious with Sexton in particular that people have talked a lot about his medical situation without seeing his records, and he's rightly made the point that people are overstepping the mark. But can I ask you in general terms, with Sexton, who failed HIA 1 and then HIA 2 happens a couple of hours after the game and he passed that, and 2 days on he's passed HIA 3. I take your point that it's impossible in the heat of the moment in 10 minutes to know if someone has a concussion or not. Would you feel more confident that a player, not necessarily Sexton here, but a player who has passed HIA 2 and then HIA 3 has passed those subsequent HIAs, that actually we could take it with a degree more certainty that they are medically fit to play and they haven't been concussed, or no?
No. The whole thing is subjective and up to the appreciation of HIA anyway, of someone's measuring their cognitive function, their memory, and it's not scientific. And if one person finds it positive, and then 5 days later, no, it's okay. Well, it's quite likely to be positive again 15 days later. It is not relevant once you've got a positive HIA. What this HIA 1, 2, and 3 should all be treated as positive. We are sort of, as I say, playing Russian Roulette with our players' brains. And Johnny's had a lot of it. I'm not talking about Johnny particularly, sure. but obviously when there's a history of quite a lot of head problems as far as not to go, you're very careful with them. If it was your own child, you'd be pretty careful.
So, be it a rugby player who takes a bang to the head or somebody walking down the street who takes a bang to the head and then they get a HIA test, what scientific standing does a HIA have?
No, it hasn't any scientific standing. It's got a certain amount of a position clinically looking at somebody, but you cannot come to any conclusion as a result of HIA. And they will do similar things in a doctor's surgery. They'll do similar things in a casualty and in A&E. They will do similar sort of things, and they will put that into the overall picture. And the overall picture won't be complete for over 24 hours because they come and they go. And that's as much as it's worth and no more.
Is there any aspect of the HIA that you would say, okay, that does have a certain grounding or a real relevance, or I would find that very indicative? Because most of us listening only have a vague idea of what a HIA is in specific terms.
Well, depending on the result of it, some of it has great significance, but a great significance as part of a clinical appraisal. Why the ordinary patient in the street who slips on a leaf and bangs their head on the ground, why they get the full clinical appraisal over several days and the rugby player gets 10 minutes. I cannot understand it.
The other aspect of this, which is disconcerting, is that for much of the past decade, so a generation or two of players, there was a 6-day return to play protocol, and that has now been extended to 12 days.
Yes.
And once upon a time, it was 3 weeks.
Yeah, and I was on World Rugby when each of those changes were made, and it was when it was changed from 3 weeks, changed right down. That's when I started to get really worried, and I attended the conferences in Prague and Zurich, the 4-yearly conference, and I wasn't really impressed because they came up with no reason or justification for any moves really like this. And I'm afraid to say that it was brought in because the game had gone professional in rugby union, and therefore to get the player back the next week in 6 to 7 days, as opposed to 2 weeks or 3 weeks, was commercially very, very valuable. And that they had nothing more to base it on than that.
And what's your interpretation of the move to 12 days now?
It's going in the right direction. I think they've got to go back to 3 weeks. They've got to go back to 3 weeks. When there's as far as I can make out, I don't know. Well, you've seen it probably better than I have, but there's all sorts of provisos with the 12 days. Oh yeah, but if you had no concussion before, then you can go back earlier than that. And they now have 3 HIAs, and it depends on you can get back before 12 days. They give every impression of really not knowing what they're doing.
And is there any science available to World Rugby and the rugby fraternity, which, in your opinion, does, in fairness, allow them to better measure, like be it brain scans or certain cognitive tests, that does allow them to better measure where a player is versus, say, the 80s when it was 3 weeks and it was just a case of, look, it's a bit more rudimentary, just take your 3 weeks. In fairness, are they better able to monitor a patient now?
They are, in fact, and in fact, the Drake test, which measures the eye movements and can be done straight away, they won't accept at the moment to say they're doing more research on it. The saliva test and the blood test, they say we're doing more research on it. They're terrified that these are scientific and these are going to show a lot worse. Yeah, and therefore, if you, in other words, the damaged brain emits a substance which gets into the bloodstream, into the saliva, and it can be measured in the saliva not in the first 15 minutes or so, because it has to go to a machine and that, but within the first half hour of the game. So we are getting more empirical as far as measuring actual injury to the brain. And I'm hopeful that is going to make a big difference.
Oh, that's very interesting. So that saliva test, if it comes to fruition then and is put into practice, that suggests that we could better adjudicate whether a player who takes a knock in a game is fit to play the following week, for instance. I suppose we still have the fundamental problem as to, is there any way to diagnose whether a player who has just taken a hit in a match is fit to return to the field?
At this stage, no. Because the saliva test, although you take the salivas within minutes, the saliva with evidence of brain injury is there within minutes, but to make it can only be measured in a machine back at the laboratory at the moment. But that will come. That will make things very, very difficult, and the powers that be are really seriously worried about that, because they're being sued, and if it turns out to be that in fact these players are all got brain damage, then so they're reluctant to let this come in very quickly. Okay,
well, we'll offer them the opportunity to reply to that, and I'm sure they would argue strongly they would do everything in their power, including bringing in the saliva test, to give a clear picture of a player's health. And they have said repeatedly they put player welfare as a priority, but I understand you're entitled to give your medical opinion on the situation as well. How would you characterise the last decade as you've watched on from afar, as this issue has been discussed more and more and more, and people are more aware of it, and yet the game has become ever more physical?
Yes, it well, you summed it up there. I viewed it with huge frustration, basically, huge frustration, and sadness that we've not employed everything within our power to find out when a player's brain is still injured, and then to keep him off the field at that stage. And
so, are you talking about the saliva test, or what other measurements or instruments would be within power to introduce?
The saliva and the blood test, but they're relatively new in the last 2 or 3 years. They didn't go back that 10 years ago. The contrast scans are becoming more and more sophisticated. The contrast MRI scans, which at a later date can show the way the brain is going at the moment, but that not to my knowledge is there anyone that shows it within that first week. But really, the research is huge that's going in, so that won't be long, thank goodness.
And Dr. Driscoll, is there anything that can be done to the game itself? I mean, tackle height has been worked on, and we see red cards increasingly in the game. Is there anything else glaring to your eye that could be done to make the frequency of head hits come down significantly?
Well, that's very interesting, and it's great the way they've reduced the head hits. That's very impressive. There's certainly things they can do at the ruck and the maul, and the way that players go into that, because there's a lot of unnecessary head injuries as people fly into these loose rucks. And besides that, I think it sounds a blasphemous thing to say that the field is getting very crowded, and if you look at the size of these guys now, and a lot of the games are based on getting the ball and running into someone else and taking him out, and then getting the ball and running into someone else. We might think about going down to 13 aside and leaving a bit of room on the outside for people to run with the ball, because that's what a lot of the game is about.
Just back to one last thought, back to the point I asked you almost at the beginning of the conversation, where I was saying, is it possible for a medical professional, in your opinion, to spot the difference between a likely concussion and a potential concussion? Likely meaning you're out of the game, HIA doesn't come into it, it's safety first, versus potential where you do have the HIA. So you're saying it's near impossible to make that distinction. Like, presumably human beings do have some capacity to take a hit. Like, would you routinely or even rarely see an occasion where there is a knock to the head and you think, well, that's unlikely to be a concussion really, and so a HIA probably is sufficient, or is it very rare that you'd see any contact with the head and think it probably is HIA and return to the field?
That's also a 64,000 question in many ways, a good question. I can think of very, very few where if you take someone off for a HIA, you haven't seen something that makes you suspect a possible concussion. If we're going for potential, you see, the concussion can come from tackles to the chest. Now, if you see someone bang on, and because of the whiplash, which we know now causes brain damage, a bad whiplash can cause brain. Well, these sort of tackles where the head's not touched are going on all the time. Well, their potential, we see, because it's not just direct knocks to the head, but the whiplash does cause this particular brain injury. So it's very, very difficult. And instead, what is happening is that they are treating all the possibly concussed, as potential, and doing HIAs on them at the moment, as far as obviously if they're carried off, they're not. But otherwise, and I think it's a big problem.
Okay. Listen, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's Dr. Barry O'Driscoll, who was, up until a decade ago, part of the medical staff at World Rugby. And we will very much extend the invitation to World Rugby to come on and discuss the issue. And again, on the point of saliva testing and the extent to which this is a priority for World Rugby, they are absolutely adamant that they are putting player welfare first at all times and applying all the expertise they possibly can to the issue. And we would certainly welcome